An island at the edge of the world, a land of mists, rivers, and rolling green hills. For thousands of years, it was just another piece of rock sitting at the far western edge of the European continent. And yet, from this small island would rise one of the most powerful, most influential, and most complex nations the world has ever seen. This is the entire history of England. To understand England, we must first understand the land itself. Long before it had a name, long before it had a people, long before it had a story. During the last great ice age, the land that would one day become England was not an island at all. It was connected to continental Europe by a vast, low-lying plain called Doggerland, a rich hunting ground of rivers, wetlands, and forests roamed by woolly mammoths, cave lions, and the earliest humans to walk these shores. Then, around 11,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. Sea levels rose, the waters crept in, and slowly, inevitably, Britain was cut off from the continent forever. But people had already arrived. Small bands of hunter-gatherers had followed the animals northward as the ice retreated. They made tools from flint, hunted deer and aurochs, and left behind their dead in ceremonial burial mounds. To understand England, we must first understand the land itself, long before it had a name, long before it had a people, long before it had a story. During the last great ice age, the land that would one day become England was not an island at all. It was connected to continental Europe by a vast, low-lying plain called Doggerland, a rich hunting ground of rivers, wetlands, and forests roamed by woolly mammoths, cave lions, and the earliest humans to walk these shores. Then, around 11,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. Sea levels rose, the waters crept in, and slowly, inevitably, Britain was cut off from the continent forever. But people had already arrived. Small bands of hunter-gatherers had followed the animals northward as the ice retreated. They made tools from flint, hunted deer and aurochs, and left behind their dead in ceremonial burial mounds that still dot the English landscape today. Around 4000 BC, a dramatic transformation swept across these islands, the Neolithic Revolution. Farming arrived from the Middle East, carried by new waves of migrants crossing the channel. Forests were cleared, fields were plowed, permanent villages began to appear, and with them came something extraordinary: monuments. At Avebury and at Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, enormous stones were dragged from hundreds of miles away and arranged in precise circles that aligned with the movements of the sun and stars. Who built them? Why? These questions still haunt us. But one thing is clear: these people were not primitive. They were organized, spiritual, and deeply connected to the cycles of the natural world. As the Bronze Age arrived around 2000 BC, new peoples, the Beaker folk, brought with them metal tools, new burial rites, and a continental culture that would merge with the native population. England was already becoming a melting pot. By around 800 BC, the Iron Age had begun, and with it came the Celts, or more precisely, the Celtic culture, spreading from Central Europe across the continent. In Britain, the Celts built hill forts on high ground, traded with Europe, and spoke a language related to modern Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. They were skilled warriors, accomplished craftsmen, and fierce in their independence. By the time the first Roman general turned his gaze northward toward Britain, the island was home to dozens of Celtic tribes: the Iceni in the east, the Trinovantes in the southeast, the Brigantes in the north, each fiercely proud, each fiercely independent, and each completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. In 55 BC, the most powerful general in the world set his eyes on Britain. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, master of the Roman legions, and the most ambitious man of his age, had heard tales of a mysterious island beyond the edge of the known world, an island rich in tin, grain, and precious metals, an island that had been supplying the Gallic tribes he had just crushed with warriors and refuge. Caesar crossed the channel with 2 legions. His first landing was little more than a reconnaissance in force. The Britons fought back on the beaches, charging their war chariots into the surf. Caesar was impressed, but he also saw that with more preparation, Britain could be taken.
The following year, 54 BC,
He returned with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, the largest invasion force to ever cross the English Channel until that point in history. He pushed north, crossed the Thames, defeated the powerful chieftain Cassivellaunus, and extracted tribute. But he did not stay. Rome had other problems. Britain would wait. It waited for nearly a century. Then, in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius, desperate for military glory to secure his political position, ordered the full conquest of Britain. 4 legions crossed the Channel under the command of General Aulus Plautius. The legions moved fast. They defeated the British tribes at the Battle of the Medway, crossed the Thames, and within weeks had taken the tribal capital of Camalodunum, modern-day Colchester. Claudius himself crossed to Britain briefly to witness the formal submission of British kings. He declared victory and returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph.
But conquest is never neat. Over the following decades, Rome fought to extend and consolidate its hold over Britain. Legions pushed west into Wales and north toward Scotland. New cities were founded: Londinium on the Thames, Eboracum in the north, Deva on the western frontier. And then came the rebellion. In 60 AD, the Iceni queen Boudica, enraged by the brutal treatment of her people and the violation of her daughters, raised an army of perhaps 100,000 warriors and swept across southeastern Britain like a fire. Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, modern St. Albans, were burned to the ground. Tens of thousands of Romans and their allies were killed. The Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus raced back from Wales and met Boudica in a pitched battle somewhere in the Midlands. Outnumbered but disciplined, the Roman legions destroyed the rebel army. Boudica took poison rather than face capture. The rebellion was over. Rome held Britain, and over the next 3 centuries, it was transformed. Latin became the language of the cities. Temples to Roman gods rose alongside native shrines. Baths, forums, amphitheaters, and villas spread across the landscape. Trade connected Britain to the farthest corners of the empire. In the far north, Rome drew a permanent line. In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall stretching 73 miles from sea to sea across the narrowest point of northern Britain, the most impressive military structure ever built in the British Isles. Hadrian's wall was not just a barrier, it was a statement. Here ends the civilized world. But empires do not last forever. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was in crisis. Barbarian tribes were hammering its borders from every direction. Legions were pulled from Britain to defend the heartland. In 407 AD, the last Roman troops left the island. They never returned. The people of Britain were on their own. The departure of the Romans left a power vacuum, and into that vacuum came new peoples from across the North Sea. The Anglo-Saxons, a collective term for the Germanic tribes of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, along with smaller groups like the Frisians, had been raiding the eastern coasts of Britain even before the Romans left. Now, with no legions to stop them, they came in greater numbers. The precise nature of what happened next is fiercely debated. Did they conquer by the sword, slaughtering and driving out the native Britons? Or was it a more gradual process? Migration, settlement, intermarriage? The archaeological and genetic evidence suggests a complex mixture of both. But the outcome was clear. Within 2 centuries, the eastern half of Britain had been transformed. The Romano-British language disappeared in England, replaced by Old English, a Germanic tongue that would eventually evolve into the language you are hearing right now. The native Britons who remained were pushed westward, into Wales, into Cornwall, into the mountains of the north, where their Celtic languages survived. 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged across England: the Heptarchy, Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the center, East Anglia and Essex on the eastern seaboard, Kent and Sussex in the south, and Wessex in the southwest. Each had its own king, its own laws, its own identity. These were not primitive people. The Anglo-Saxons were accomplished farmers, skilled metalworkers, and sophisticated storytellers. The epic poem Beowulf, one of the greatest works of literature in the English language, was composed in Old English during this period. And then came Christianity. By the 8th century, England was Christian, prosperous, and beginning to develop the institutions of a complex society. Kings issued law codes, bishops held councils, merchants traded across the North Sea. England was becoming a recognizable nation. And then, from the north, came the thunder of oars on the sea.
In 597 AD, Pope Gregory the Great sent a monk named Augustine to convert the English. Augustine landed in Kent, baptized King Ethelbert, and established a church at Canterbury that still stands as the spiritual heart of English Christianity. Over the following decades, missionaries spread across England, building churches, founding monasteries, and converting king after king. The monasteries that sprang up across England became the centers of learning and culture. At Lindisfarne, on the northeast coast, monks produced the extraordinary Lindisfarne Gospels, illustrated manuscripts of breathtaking beauty that stand as monuments to the creative genius of early medieval England. On the 8th of June, 793 AD, monks on the holy island of Lindisfarne looked out to sea and saw something terrifying. Longships, their carved prows cutting through the waves, crammed with armed men. The Vikings had come to England. The raid on Lindisfarne shocked the Christian world. It seemed like the end of days. Pagans desecrating holy sites, killing monks, plundering the treasures of God. Alcuin of York, the greatest scholar of the age, wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." At first, the attacks were hit-and-run raids. Strike fast, take everything, disappear before the defenders could respond. Monasteries were particularly tempting targets, wealthy, undefended, and filled with gold and silver. But the Vikings were more than just raiders. They were also traders, explorers, and settlers, among the most dynamic and adventurous peoples in the world. And by the 860s, they had decided they wanted more than plunder. They wanted land. In 865, a massive force of Danes, later called the Great Heathen Army by the terrified Anglo-Saxons, landed in East Anglia with horses and siege equipment. This was no raid. This was conquest. The Great Army moved systematically through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell in 867. East Anglia fell in 869. Its king, Edmund, was captured, tied to a tree, and shot with arrows when he refused to renounce Christianity. Mercia fell in 874. By 876, only Wessex remained. The King of Wessex was Alfred, a scholar, a soldier, and one of the most remarkable human beings of the medieval age. In the winter of 878, Alfred's situation was desperate. The Danish king Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack that scattered his forces and drove him into the Somerset marshes. He hid in the wetlands of Athelney, sheltered by ordinary people, planning his comeback. Legend says it was here that a peasant woman asked him to watch her cakes, and, lost in thought, he let them burn. But Alfred was not finished. That spring, he sent messengers through Wessex calling his thanes to arms. They gathered at Egbert's Stone and marched to meet the Danes at the Battle of Edington. The result was a decisive English victory. Guthrum was captured, and Alfred made him do something remarkable: convert to Christianity, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore divided England in two: the west and south under Alfred, the east and north under Danish rule, in what became known as the Danelaw. Alfred was more than just a warrior. He rebuilt the defenses of Wessex, creating a network of fortified towns called burhs. He reorganized the army so that half the fighting men were always available. He reformed the legal system. He promoted education and literacy, personally translating important Latin texts into Old English. He founded the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the first continuous history of England in the English language. After Alfred came his children and grandchildren, and they carried the fight to the Danes. His son Edward the Elder and his daughter Athelflaed, the remarkable Lady of the Mercians, systematically reconquered the Danelaw, pushing north year by year. And in 927, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, perhaps the most underrated monarch in English history, completed what his grandfather had started. He conquered the Viking kingdom of York, accepted the submission of the Scottish king and the Welsh princess, and took a title no English king had held before: Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. England, as a unified kingdom, had been born. But the Viking threat was not over. A new wave of Danish attacks began in the 980s under King Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Canute. The weak English king Athelred, history has given him the cruel epithet the unready, meaning poorly advised, tried to buy off the Danes with massive payments of silver called Danegeld. It didn't work. In 1013, Sweyn conquered all of England, and when he died in 1042, his son Canute became the first Danish king of England and one of the greatest monarchs to ever rule the country. Canute was a statesman of rare ability. He ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously, and governed England so well that the English nobility came to regard him as one of their own. But after Canute died in 1035, his empire collapsed. By 1042, the House of Wessex was restored in the person of Edward the Confessor, a deeply religious man, more interested in building Westminster Abbey than in the brutal business of kingship. And when Edward died on the 5th of January 1066 without an heir, he set in motion a chain of events that would change England and the world forever.
The year 1066 is perhaps the most famous date in all of English history, a year of battles, of betrayal, and of transformation so profound that its effects can still be felt in the English language today. When Edward the Confessor died, 3 men claimed the throne of England: Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England, Earl of Wessex and Edward's brother-in-law, was crowned king the very day after Edward's death. He was the English candidate, with the support of the English nobility, but his claim was contested. Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, one of the greatest warriors of the Viking Age, claimed England by right of an old agreement between former Scandinavian kings. And William, Duke of Normandy, a bastard son of a Norman duke and a tanner's daughter, who had clawed his way to power through decades of brutal warfare, claimed that Edward himself had promised him the throne, and that Harold had sworn an oath to support that claim. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada landed in the north of England with a fleet of 300 ships. Harold of England marched north with extraordinary speed and caught the Vikings completely off guard at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a devastating English victory. Harold Hardrada was killed. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Viking army to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. As the day wore on, the English line weakened. And then Harold was struck. Tradition says by an arrow to the eye, though modern historians debate this. He fell. His household troops fought to the death around his body. And as darkness fell on the ridge at Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon age of England was over. William moved on London. On Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, the church Edward the Confessor had built and never lived to see finished, William was crowned King of England. The Norman Conquest was not just a change of kings, it was a revolution. But Harold had no time to celebrate. Even as the battle was being fought, news came that William of Normandy had landed on the south coast of England. Harold marched his exhausted army 300 miles south in just 9 days. On the 14th of October, 1066, the two armies met on a ridge near Hastings. The Battle of Hastings lasted all day. The English fought in a tight shield wall on the ridge, the Normans attacking uphill with cavalry, archers, and infantry. Time and again, the Norman attacks were repulsed. Then, William used a feigned retreat. His cavalry pretended to flee, drawing English soldiers down the hill in pursuit, where they were cut down. William rewarded his followers with English lands and stripped the English nobility of almost everything they had. Within a generation, virtually every great lord in England was Norman. French became the language of the court, the law, and the aristocracy. Old English continued as the language of the common people. And from this collision of languages, French and Old English, the extraordinary hybrid tongue we call modern English would eventually emerge. William commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, the most ambitious administrative survey ever undertaken in medieval Europe. Every village, every manor, every mill in England was recorded. It gave William total knowledge of his kingdom's wealth. It stands today as one of the most extraordinary documents. The English Reformation was complex, contested, and often violent. People died on both sides. Catholics who refused to accept royal supremacy, Protestants who pushed reform too far for Henry's taste. The king himself remained theologically conservative. He simply wanted to be pope in his own kingdom. Henry's search for a male heir consumed the rest of his life and produced one of history's most extraordinary sequences of marriages. Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but then miscarried. She was accused of adultery and treason and beheaded on Tower Green in May 1536. Jane Seymour finally gave him a son, Edward, but died of childbed fever within days. Anne of Cleves was chosen by portrait and rejected in person. Catherine Howard was beheaded for alleged infidelity. Catherine Parr survived by outliving him. The Norman kings ruled England for less than a century before the crown passed through a bloody civil war called the Anarchy to a new dynasty, the Plantagenets. King Henry II, who came to the throne in 1154, was one of the most energetic and capable rulers England would ever have. He governed an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, England, Normandy, Anjou, and vast territories in France through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most remarkable woman of the medieval age. Henry reformed English law, creating the common law system that still forms the basis of legal systems across the English-speaking world today. But his reign was also marked by one of history's most dramatic murders. His old friend, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, clashed repeatedly with Henry over the rights of the church. In a moment of rage, Henry reportedly asked, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?"
4 of his knights took him literally. They rode to Canterbury and cut Becket down in his own cathedral on the 29th of December, 1170. The murder shocked Europe. Becket was rapidly canonized, and Henry, in penance, allowed himself to be flogged at Becket's tomb. Henry II was followed by his famous son, Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, who spent almost none of his reign in England, preferring to lead the Third Crusade to the Holy Land. He is remembered as one of history's greatest warriors. He was also, as a king of England, nearly useless. His brother John, who followed him in 1199, was perhaps worse. Paranoid, cruel, and spectacularly unlucky in war, John managed to lose virtually all of England's territories in France to the French king Philip II. His barons finally reached their limit.
In June 1215, on a meadow at Runnymede on the Thames, King John was forced to set his seal to a document that would change the course of Western history: Magna Carta. The Great Charter established for the first time in English history that the king was not above the law. No free man could be imprisoned, exiled, or dispossessed except by lawful judgment of his peers. Taxation required consent. Even the king had limits. Magna Carta was not immediately effective. John had no intention of honoring it, and the Pope annulled it almost immediately. But it became a symbol. Over the following centuries, it would be reconfirmed over 40 times. It planted a seed that would eventually grow into constitutional government, not just in England, but across the world. The 14th century brought catastrophe. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, the English longbowmen of Edward III cut down the flower of French chivalry with devastating efficiency. At Poitiers, in 1356, his son, the Black Prince, captured the King of France himself. England seemed invincible.
Then, in the summer of 1348, a ship from Gascony arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Its crew were sick. Within days, people in the town began to fall ill. Horrifying symptoms: black swellings in the armpits and groin, coughing blood, dying within days. The Black Death had arrived in England. Over the next 2 years, the plague swept through every town and village in the country. By some estimates, it killed between a third and half of the entire population, somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people dead out of a pre-plague population of perhaps 5 million. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields went unplowed. Churches stood empty.
The social consequences were revolutionary. With so many workers dead, those who survived could demand higher wages. The old feudal bonds began to crack. When the government tried to hold wages down and impose new taxes, the result was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the first mass uprising of ordinary English people in recorded history. Rebels led by Wat Tyler marched on London, opened the prisons, and killed the Archbishop of Canterbury. The revolt was eventually crushed, but England would never be quite the same again. The 15th century brought England's most famous civil conflict, the Wars of the Roses. From 1455 to 1485, the rival branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by a white, fought for the throne of England in a series of battles that left a trail of dead kings, executed nobles, and traumatized survivors.
The conflict produced some of history's most dramatic moments. The young King Edward IV seizing the throne through military genius, the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower, and the final battle at Bosworth Field in 1485, where the last Plantagenet king, Richard III, was cut down fighting desperately on foot after his horse was killed, crying out in the chaos of battle. Richard's crown, knocked from his helmet, was found in a hawthorn bush on the battlefield. It was placed on the head of the Tudor claimant, Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, and a new era of English history began.
The Tudors were an unlikely dynasty. Henry VII, the first of them, was a cautious, careful, calculating man, far more accountant than warrior. He understood that England needed stability after 30 years of civil war, and he was determined to provide it. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the two Rose dynasties. He filled the royal treasury through careful financial management. He encouraged trade and exploration, and he laid the foundations for a dynasty that would transform England and the world. When Henry VII died in 1509, he was succeeded by his 17-year-old son, Henry VIII, and suddenly, everything changed.
The young Henry was everything his father was not: physically magnificent, intellectually brilliant, musically gifted, and possessed of an ego the size of his kingdom. He seemed the ideal Renaissance prince. But over the following decades, his desire for a male heir would drive him to an act that shook the very foundations of European Christendom. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Convinced that God was punishing him for marrying his dead brother's wife, Henry sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII. The Pope refused. He was under the political influence of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Henry's response was extraordinary. Between 1532 and 1534, he broke England away from the Catholic Church entirely. Parliament passed a series of acts establishing the Church of England with the king as its supreme head. Monasteries, the great centers of medieval religious life, were dissolved and their vast wealth confiscated. Monks and nuns were evicted. The treasures of centuries were...
The English Reformation was complex, contested, and often violent. People died on both sides: Catholics who refused to accept royal supremacy, Protestants who pushed reform too far for Henry's taste. The king himself remained theologically conservative. He simply wanted to be pope in his own kingdom. Henry's search for a male heir consumed the rest of his life and produced one of history's most extraordinary sequences of marriages. Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but then miscarried. She was accused of adultery and treason and beheaded on Tower Green in May 1536. Jane Seymour finally gave him a son, Edward, but died of childbed fever within days. Anne of Cleves was chosen by portrait and rejected in person. Catherine Howard was beheaded for alleged infidelity. Catherine Parr survived by outliving him. Henry VIII died in January 1547, leaving behind 3 children, a transformed church, and a revolution in English governance that could never be undone. His son, Edward VI, ruled for only 6 years before dying of tuberculosis. His half-sister Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, briefly restored Catholicism, burning nearly 300 Protestants at the stake and earning the epithet Bloody Mary. She died childless in 1558. And so, the crown passed to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the last of the Tudors. Elizabeth I was perhaps the greatest monarch England has ever had. Intelligent, charismatic, and possessed of extraordinary political instincts, she navigated the treacherous waters of 16th century politics with a combination of pragmatism and brilliance that left her enemies perpetually off balance. She re-established the Protestant Church of England on moderate terms that most English people could accept. She presided over a cultural flowering that produced Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, and Sidney. She built up the Royal Navy into a formidable fighting force. She encouraged explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh to range across the world's oceans. And in 1588, she faced her greatest challenge, the Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain, the greatest power in Europe, sent 130 warships and 30,000 men to overthrow the Protestant Queen and return England to Catholicism. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham and vice-commanded by Drake, met them in the Channel.
What followed was not quite the decisive naval victory English tradition would later make it. The real destroyers of the Armada were the storms of the North Sea that wrecked the scattered Spanish fleet as it attempted to sail home around Scotland and Ireland. But the English played their part, and when the storms had finished their work, England was safe. Elizabeth addressed her troops at Tilbury as the Armada threatened. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It is perhaps the most famous speech in English history. Elizabeth died in March 1603, childless, the last of the Tudors. She left behind a transformed England, richer, more self-confident, more Protestant, and already beginning to look outward toward the wider world.
When Elizabeth died without an heir, the crown of England passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, England and Scotland shared a monarch. James was an intelligent but deeply unpopular king. He believed passionately in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were appointed directly by God and answerable to no one but him. Parliament had different ideas. His reign began with a near disaster, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when a group of Catholic conspirators led by Guy Fawkes attempted to blow up Parliament during the state opening, with the king inside. The plot was discovered at the last moment. Fawkes was tortured and executed. England celebrated its escape with bonfires that are still lit every year on the 5th of November. The tensions between the Crown and Parliament over taxation, religion, and the limits of royal power continued to build under James and exploded under his son, Charles I.
Charles was everything that was wrong with the theory of divine kingship, genuinely convinced of his own rightness, constitutionally incapable of compromise, and possessed of a fatal combination of stubbornness and indecision. He attempted to rule without Parliament for 11 years, but personal rule, raising money through dubious legal means and antagonizing virtually every powerful group in the kingdom. When his attempt to impose a new prayer book on Scotland provoked a Scottish rebellion that he could not afford to put down without money he could only get from Parliament, the whole system collapsed. Parliament met, grievances poured out, negotiations broke down, and in August 1642, England went to war with itself. The English Civil War pitted the Royalists, the Cavaliers, against the Parliamentarians, the Roundheads. It was not a neat class conflict. Royalists and Parliamentarians could be found in every county and every social class. But broadly, it was a war about who held sovereign power in England, the king or the Parliament.
The early years were inconclusive, but the Parliamentarians found their commander in Oliver Cromwell, a Huntingdonshire country gentleman of no particular military experience who turned out to be one of history's great soldiers. Cromwell reorganized the parliamentary forces into the new model army, professional, disciplined, and fired by religious conviction. At the Battle of Naseby in June 1645, the new model army destroyed the main royalist force. Charles surrendered to the Scots, who handed him to Parliament. But what to do with a defeated king? The answer was unprecedented. Charles was put on trial for high treason against his own people. He refused to recognize the court's authority. On the 30th of January, 1649, on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, Charles I was beheaded.
England was a republic. The monarchy was abolished. The House of Lords was abolished. Cromwell ruled England as Lord Protector, in everything but name a military dictator. He crushed rebellions in Ireland and Scotland with merciless efficiency. He fought wars against the Dutch and the Spanish. He tinkered endlessly with systems of government that never quite worked. When Cromwell died in 1658, the Republic died with him. His son Richard was wholly inadequate to the task and resigned after months. In 1660, Charles II, the dead king's son, who had spent years as a penniless exile across Europe, was invited back to England. The Restoration was greeted with extraordinary popular enthusiasm. After the austere years of Puritan rule, England erupted in celebration. Theaters reopened, music returned to churches. The king was back. But the constitutional questions had not been resolved. Charles II was clever enough to avoid a direct confrontation with Parliament. His brother James II was not. James was openly Catholic, a fatal flaw in Restoration England. And when he began promoting Catholics to positions of power, the Protestant establishment panicked. In 1688, a group of English nobles invited William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder and husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to come to England and protect English liberties. William landed with an army. James's support evaporated. He fled to France. The Glorious Revolution, so called because it was achieved with almost no bloodshed, transformed the English Constitution forever.
William and Mary accepted the Bill of Rights in 1689, which established parliamentary sovereignty, banned Catholic monarchs, guaranteed free elections, and protected individual liberties. The days of divine right monarchy in England were over.
In 1707, under Queen Anne, the English and Scottish parliaments merged through the Act of Union, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. England as a separate political entity ceased to exist, absorbed into something larger, something that would shake the world. The 18th century brought Britain, and England at its heart, to the brink of global dominance. The Hanoverian kings were German and largely uninterested in governing Britain directly, which meant that Parliament and the emerging institution of the Prime Minister took on real power. Britain fought France across the globe, in North America, India, the Caribbean, and the high seas, and emerged from these conflicts as the world's leading naval and commercial power. But it also suffered its greatest imperial humiliation when in 1783, the American colonies declared and won their independence, stripping Britain of its richest and most populous overseas territories.
Then came the Industrial Revolution, and England was where it began. In the valleys of Lancashire and Yorkshire, the Midlands and South Wales, steam engines were built, mills were constructed, railways were laid. Coal and iron transformed the landscape. Cities exploded in size. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, places that had been modest market towns, became vast industrial metropolises almost overnight. The human cost was immense. Children worked in mines. Families crowded into appalling urban slums. Life expectancy in the new industrial cities could be as low as 30 years. But the wealth generated was extraordinary, and it funded the greatest empire the world had ever seen. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire covered a quarter of the world's land surface and governed a quarter of its people. Victoria, the young queen who came to the throne in 1837 and ruled for 63 years, became the symbol of an age. But the 20th century brought catastrophe.
In August 1914, Britain entered the First World War, a conflict of incomprehensible scale and horror. By the time it ended in November 1918, nearly 1 million British soldiers were dead. An entire generation had been consumed. And barely 20 years later, it happened again. Worse. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. The following year brought the darkest moment in modern English history: the fall of France, the evacuation of Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain. England standing alone against the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, broadcast to the nation in those desperate days: "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall..."
The RAF pilots who flew against the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1940, Churchill called them the few, saved England from invasion. The ordinary people who endured the Blitz, the months of German bombing that reduced parts of London and other cities to rubble, showed a stubborn resilience that defined the national character. By 1945, the war was won, but England and Britain would never be quite the same again. The empire was ending. The age of American hegemony had begun. And the extraordinary island story that had begun on the shores of Doggerland thousands of years before was entering a new chapter, as complicated, as contested, and as fascinating as all the ones that had come before.
England, an island forged by ice and water, shaped by Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Normans, and countless others, ruled by kings and queens who were saints and monsters and everything in between, transformed by Reformation, Revolution, industrialization, and war. Its language, that extraordinary mongrel tongue that borrowed from Latin and French and Old Norse and Germanic dialects, has become the first truly global language in human history, spoken by more than 1 billion people on every continent. Its institutions, parliament, common law, constitutional monarchy, the idea that government must be accountable to the governed, have shaped democracies around the world. England's story is not finished. It never is. Every generation adds its chapter.